Welcome to the Sirius report. This is Paul, and today we're assessing why, at a key meeting, once again, the Japanese and the South Koreans have sided with China against US tariffs. Now, what this relates to is a joint statement that came out from the ASEAN plus three countries, and this was the 28th session of this. Also, that's to do with their finance ministers. And there was also a central bank governors meeting. This took place in Milan on the 4th of May, obviously, of this year. Now, why are we assessing this? Because the ASEAN plus three countries, the three is China, Japan, and South Korea. We'll come on to who the ASEAN countries are shortly. But they obviously issued this joint statement, and included within that joint statement was a discussion related to trade protectionism. And I'll come on to that shortly because I thought it was a good opportunity for people who don't know who the ASEAN countries are to list them. That stands for the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations. This is an intergovernmental organization that includes Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, Brunei, Thailand, Myanmar, the Philippines, Cambodia, Singapore, and Malaysia. This is a leader in global trade. Whatever the West likes to say to the contrary, it's not true. Because Asia accounts currently in 2024, the latest figures we have, for nearly 60% of global trade. Now, the region's success model is based on true trade liberalization, true globalization, the real integration into value chains, supply chains, etc. This has been a major success story in recent years. Yes, it's going to face challenges, and one of those challenges does relate to trade protectionism and US tariff policies. Now, they came out and made a statement talking about escalating trade protectionism even, which of course relates to US tariff policy, saying, look, it weighs on global trade, it can cause economic fragmentation, it can impact trade, investment, and capital flows across Asia. So therefore, they're concerned about near-term prospects could be affected by other external risks, including tighter global financial conditions. We've talked about all this previously, slowdown in major trading partners, and the corresponding reduction in investment flows. So clearly, the ASEAN plus three countries want to enhance regional unity and cooperation to obviously deal with this heightened uncertainty and obviously the issues with respect to US tariff policy. So their current priority is clearly to reinforce long-term resilience, to remain flexible, and to deal with rising protectionism and volatile global financial conditions. So fiscally speaking, that includes rebuilding policy buffers and supporting long-term targets to have sustained growth and implementing structural reforms. This is a very clear statement to the United States that they're not going to tolerate the US's behavior. They will work collectively to get around these problems. And this, of course, will include deciding to maybe rebalance, recalibrate trade amongst themselves, maybe to start to reduce the number of exports from the United States, also correspondingly imports to the United States, because they need markets that are sustainable. They need markets that are predictable, and they can't deal with the United States changing its mind every 15 minutes as to what they're going to do today, tomorrow, next week, whether it's in terms of the numbers associated with tariffs, what those tariffs are, Will that also include sanctioning countries, because China's already had that experience with respect to the likes of Huawei and semiconductor chips? So the ASEAN countries are fully aware of the issues China's had. They're very concerned about what policy initiatives the United States may come up with. And they're therefore going to have to deal with things like monetary policy based on issues domestically. And this will also relate to exchange rate flexibility to handle all the external shocks. So their export markets, though, and their capability to grow their economies have been increasingly diversifying in recent years to account for these kind of problems associated with the United States weaponizing the dollar, the risk of the United States sanctioning countries, maybe even the risk of the United States cutting other nations off from SWIFT, and just generally the United States deciding the rules-based order doesn't exist. Well, the ACM Plus 3 is part of the multipolar world, part of this enormous trading bloc who are working successfully together with win-win cooperation. And in doing so, this is increasing domestic demand and interregional trade, which are the key drivers of growth. And if you look at the ASEAN countries, the regional economy grew by 4.3% in 2024. That was just marginally less than the 4.4% growth in 2023. Regional growth is driven by domestic spending and external demand. The other promising thing for them, as opposed to us in the West, is inflation is subsiding. Headline inflation is returning to what it was pre-COVID pandemic levels. That's not for all, but most regional economies. Core inflation's also declining, and that's because they're dealing with their monetary policy stance effectively. And this is anchored inflation expectations. Broadly speaking, financial markets in the ASEAN countries are functioning well, and external demand remains. They've got flexible exchange rates and also critically sufficient international reserves, which means they're not going to have to go to a begging bowl to the IMF or anyone else to bail them out. Now, what will regional growth be in 2025? Probably around 4%. But yes, they're going to have to deal with issues like protectionism and US tariff policies and trade tensions, geopolitical issues. But domestic demand remains robust and there's strong investment activity and also, decent consumption. What you've got to understand with regards to the ASEAN Plus 3, they're going to remain a key driver of the global economy. They'll contribute in excess in the future because obviously poles will balance things out. There'll be more economic growth in the future in the likes of Africa, so it'll be probably over 40% global growth with inflation below 2% throughout 2025. The other thing, of course, that Japan and South Korea, including China and the ASEAN countries, have agreed to is full commitment to true multilateralism, to the rules-based order, to non-discriminatory, free, fair, open, and transparent multilateral trading systems. Whatever you think about the WTO will be at its core. They want to enhance macroeconomic policies, promote regional financial cooperation, and have unimpeded industrial and supply chains, which will help grow the regional economy and financial stability. This is all, of course, increasingly done under the auspices of trading in non-dollar terms, of being able to raise debt in non-dollar terms, and being able to develop their bloc in a way that's not going to be impeded in the future by the US trying to weaponize the dollar or weaponize their economies in any other way. The other thing that's worth noting is this also supports the implementation of the RCEP, that's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, That's a free trade agreement amongst the Asia Pacific countries. This is huge. It's Australia, Brunei, Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea again, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, New Zealand, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. Why is that important? Well, it accounts for 30% of the world's population, about 30% of global GDP. It's the largest trading bloc in history. And this was signed in November of 2020 when the RCEP became the first free trade agreement amongst the major economies in Asia that included, of course, China, Indonesia, and critically, Japan and South Korea. So whilst Japan and South Korea remain vassal states, they remain states that are also seen as traditional allies with the United States. They're increasingly realizing why the future is the multipolar world, why trading in cooperation with China, with the ASEAN countries is extremely important. And whilst the Japanese finance minister made a statement on Japanese television that they may use US treasuries as a bargaining chip or a card, they then subsequently denied that they meant they were going into trade talks with the United States seeking to weaponize US treasuries. Well, I would say if you make a statement on national TV, you meant it. The fact they've backtracked is probably because the United States got rather angry with the statement. So they went, right, let's walk back from this. Does that mean Japan won't do so in the future? They may very well do so, because traditional allies are beginning to see the writing on the wall. They're beginning to see why the dollar as a world reserve currency is coming to an end, why they have to trade very differently in a world that actually promotes win-win cooperation, that is mutually beneficial to all countries, and why doing so will mean not trading in the dollar, not being subservient to the United States as a vassal state that Washington can wipe its feet on. So that's going to mean they're going to have to change their policy with regards to military escalation, particularly pointing missiles at China or North Korea, for example. But this meeting's a very telling indictment of why the world is grown sick and tired of the US trying to bully them with ridiculous tariff policies that don't work. It's also worth noting at this meeting, there was the governor of the PBOC, the Chinese Central Bank, but there was also the president of the Asian Development Bank. Recall, of course, with regards to the Asian Development Bank, that the United States went there trying to effectively suggest to the Asian Development Bank not to give China any loans in future for development and infrastructure projects. This is quite unbelievable, but no doubt the Asia Development Bank just ignored this request from the United States, and it's business as usual. But meetings like this will go on in the future, and more countries like Japan and South Korea are going to stand up to the United States and say, we're not going to tolerate this protectionist policy, because in the end, we might resolve our differences today, but you may change the goalpost tomorrow. And we need to work with these other countries, because that is the future growth center for the next 20, 50, whatever, 100 years. It's not solely, but it will be an enormous growth center in the world. And we need to be part of that. I mean, after all, Japan and South Korea, that's where that's where geographically they're located. They don't want to be hostile to the Chinese or other countries. And this is why statements like this are extremely important, indicative of this big mindset shift that's happening in this part of the world, and why we have to take note of it and realize that in conjunction with other statements that have happened in recent weeks, that countries like Japan and South Korea no longer want to be vassal states. Yes, it's not easy to stop being a vassal state. They want to cooperate and work with the United States, but they don't want to do so on the basis that the United States is trying to bully them into not working with China or seeking to have a trade deal that skews the relationship so it's damaging to these countries. And the argument is when you have blocs like the ASEAN countries and the RCEP, why would you not decide actually to work more with each other in the future and become less reliant on a totally unreliable partner, as we know is the case and increasingly so in this Trump administration with the US itself. And with that, we end today's podcast. Thank you very much for listening, for all your ongoing support, which is greatly appreciated. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. It's very helpful if you comment. It gives us feedback, but also helps in terms of the algos. And because at the end of the day, we're trying to grow this channel because we believe more than anything or at any point in history that being informed is paramount and being entertained is absolutely of zero benefit to any of us, because this is a paradigm shift. It's something that doesn't happen very often in history. We could go another 500 years, 200 years, whatever, before it happens again, if indeed it even happens again. Such is the gravity of what's now happening. And with that, I'll say goodbye.